Good evening. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Robert Stern, and I'm the Dean of the school, and it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all here in a formal manner to the symposium, which has already been off to a brilliant start, starting at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and ending only about 8 minutes earlier in a heated discussion, the kind I admire, and what it's all about to have in a university. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Brendan Gill lecture, which serves as the keynote to the symposium Middle Ground, Middle East, Religious Sites in Urban Context. This symposium is jointly sponsored by our school, Yale Divinity School, the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and the Yale Center for Middle East Studies. By focusing on the role of religious sites representing the three Abrahamic traditions in shaping contemporary urban environments in the Middle East, it is our hope at this critical time to broaden interdisciplinary and interfaith discourse to embrace the physical realm. I would like to express my appreciation to our partners in organizing this symposium, Dean Harry Attridge of the Divinity School, Martin Jean, Director of the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and Marcia Inhorn, Chair of the Council on Middle East Studies. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Emily Bakemeyer, Deputy Provost for the Arts and Humanities, and Barbara Shaler, Deputy Provost for the Arts, for their support. Additionally, I would extend further thanks to the many at the School of Architecture who have worked to make this symposium possible, including Associate Dean John Jacobson and our school's special events coordinators, Richard DeFlumery and Robbie Lynn Harnoy. Most particularly, I want to acknowledge the erudition and patience of Carla Britton of our faculty, who has worked tirelessly to bring together the very many speakers who are making today and tomorrow's events a most memorable occasion. I wish to thank those many scholars as well and professionals who've taken time out of busy schedules and come from considerable distances to share their ideas with us. This is a special occasion, one that happens too infrequently when architects, scholars, and journalists who in their work are deeply engaged with the relationships between the sacred and the quotidian gather together to share research and professional work with each other and the interested public. That the setting is a school of architecture makes the proceedings all the more significant. The Yale School of Architecture is committed to this conversation as a cornerstone of our ongoing belief in architecture as a cultural enabler. In April 2003, together with support from the Edward J. and Dorothy Kemp Memorial Fund at the Yale Center for International Studies and with the Yale Department of Art History, we began this conversation with a symposium, Local Sites of Global Practice, Modernism in the Middle East, and the Middle East. And that was organized by Sandy Eisenstadt, then of our faculty and now of the University of Delaware, and Kishwar Rizvi, whom you have already met this afternoon, of our Department of Art History. The proceedings of that symposium were published as Modernism and the Middle East in 2008 by the University of Washington. At least one of our participants today was a critical contributor, a key contributor to that event and text. This weekend's conference continues that discussion, and even more particularly, the discussion arising from the 2007 symposium, Constructing the Ineffable, Contemporary Sacred Architecture, which Carla Britton also organized for us, the proceedings of which were published this month by the Yale University Press, and copies of which will be available for sale in our gallery following this evening's lecture, where we will all join our lecturer and our many speakers for refreshments after the talk. This weekend's conference is also an extension of several other recent initiatives at Yale that address issues of faith and culture in the Middle East. These include Yale's ties to the Library of Alexandria, and especially the recent New Beginning Conference, the Yale Alumni Symposium at the American University of Beirut on the topic of the future of the Arab city, and the Yale Center for Faith and Culture's focus on questions of faith and globalization. Additionally, our students, our advanced students in architecture, frequently travel with their teachers to many of the sites that we are discussing today and tomorrow in the Middle East. And one of our participants tomorrow, Makram Al-Qadi, will lead a group of design students to Lebanon and Syria, if everything works out, where they will study sacred sites in preparation for the design of a mosque, which they will undertake in the studios here at Yale. With your permission, a word about the Gill Lecture Series and the man whom it honors, Brendan Gill, Yale College class of 1936. The Gill Lecture Series was endowed by the San Francisco architect Herbert McLaughlin, Yale College class of 1956, Yale School of Architecture class of 58. The series has a distinguished history, bringing important critics and historians to our school. Tonight's lecturer, Professor Nasser Rabat, is the 29th lecturer in a series that has included Wendy Steiner, Esther DeCosta-Meyer, David Hickey, Kenneth Frampton, who will speak tomorrow and is in the audience now, Charles Jenks, Jean-Louis Cohen, Roger Khanna, Hal Foster, and Anthony Vidler, Dean of the Cooper Union School of Architecture. The previous Gill lecturer was Glenn Adamson, who delivered the keynote address to the fall 2009 symposium, Constructed Objects, Architects as Designers in the 20th Century. Brendan Gill was for most of his long career associated with the New Yorker magazine, contributing casuals, fiction, and drama criticism. His career at the New Yorker culminated with his term as the magazine's architecture critic, taking over the Skyline column that had previously been Lewis Mumford's. Tonight's Brendan Gill lecturer, Nasser Rabat, is Aga Khan Professor of Islamic Architecture and Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A graduate of the University of Damascus in Syria, from which he holds the Bachelor of Architecture, Professor Rabat also holds the Master in Architecture and Urban Design from UCLA and a PhD in Architecture, Art, and Environmental Studies from MIT, which afterwards invited him to join its faculty in 1991, and where he continues to serve with great distinction. Professor Rabat's interests are very broad within this field, including ancient and medieval urban history, Middle Eastern Islamic studies, colonial and post-colonial studies, and, of course, Islamic architecture. As a scholar, Professor Rabat has been astonishingly prolific, with numerous articles and books, including his widely admired The Citadel of Cairo, a new interpretation of Royal Mamluk architecture, published by E.J. Brill in 1995, and more recently his criticism as Commitment, Viewpoints in Arabism, Architecture and History, published in Beirut in 2010. It's now my pleasure to welcome Professor Nasser Rabat to Yale as he delivers tonight's keynote address, brilliantly titled, given the lay of the land so far, Architecture Between Religion and Politics. Professor Rabat.
Thank you. The lecture I'm going to be delivering is dedicated to the memory of Oleg Grabar, my professor, mentor, and friend. Those who knew Oleg Grabar will hear his voice in the notes that I will be delivering, and will probably also laugh at the way I've appropriated some of his ideas. I wish also to thank Carla Britton for not just inviting me, but also for involving me in a discussion about how this conference is to develop. I'm afraid, Carla, I'm not going to listen to any of the recommendations about what we are supposed to be covering in our talks. But Huwaida, you would be happy to know I will be talking about the patrons. The sacred geography of the West was mapped out in the Middle East. This is both a truism and a deeply disturbing statement to many groups and sects today. It is a truism because there is no denying that the history and theology of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, emerged in the Middle East before traveling to the West, where they were variously incorporated in its self-representation. The Middle East, in fact, remains until today the ground upon which the interplay between the three religions, the three variations of monotheism, unfolds, even if it does so often to unpleasant results and with wide-reaching consequences. And that is why my introductory statement has been upsetting to religious zealots, Cold War-like political strategists, and believers in racial and ethnic differences. They all see the world in clearly demarcated and opposing camps, each the negative reflection of the other. To them, middle grounds are problematic, for they do not easily fit in any binary constructs, even though they, by their very nature, presuppose their existence. The Middle East, by its very colonially inspired name, but also by its history and location, is an exemplary middle ground. Located between Europe and Asia and Africa, between Christianity and Islam, and between history as destiny and history as dialectical process, the Middle East has been the place where civilizations, religions, and empires intersected since at least the time of Alexander the Great, even though the intensity of its middleness waxed and waned over time, depending on the dominant empires and their shifting boundaries. These junctures left their indelible marks on the topography and architecture of the Middle East, but also on the compositions and cultures of its population. To take religion as index, Syria, for example, has 17 religious historical communities still living side by side, some of which, like the Yazidis, the Alawis, the Syriacs, and the Druze, hardly exist outside its borders. Likewise, the country boasts of distinct cultural layers that go back to the 5th millennium BCE, when the first organized religions emerged in the fertile valleys of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. Syria also has a concentration of classical architecture that is matched only by Italy and Turkey, and of Islamic architecture that rivals those of Egypt and India. The Middle East's middle ground position, however, has been noticeably eroding in the last 60 years. The geopolitical and cultural frontiers between the West and the Middle East have been slowly hardening, and the demographics of both Europe and the Middle East have been accordingly changing, so that the Middle East is no longer the locus of cosmopolitanism that its religious and political history entails, or that its brush with European colonialism in the 19th century engendered. Instead, a general mood of religiously inclined monoculturalism has infiltrated the region, with pockets of ferociously protective communities asserting their independence by brandishing their religious or ethnic or linguistic differences as national traits. Some, like the Jews, have already inaugurated the process and created their own state. Others, like the Iraqi Kurds, have carved out their autonomous area within a state. Still others, like the Shiites in southern Lebanon, have formed a territorially and socially independent, though politically contingent, state within a state. This scene, I submit, is the unsurprising outcome of colonial and post-colonial politics and the apparent failure of the modern nationalist project in most countries of the Middle East. And let us remember here the present-day acute cases of Iraq, the Sudan, and Lebanon. The roots of the status go back to a moment that could have come down to us mainly as a cruel colonial farce, had it not been for the chain of events it is conventionally purported to have unleashed. When Napoleon Bonaparte landed with his army in Alexandria, in Egypt, in July 1798 to occupy the country, his cunning speech, translated into Arabic, promised the Egyptians liberation from their oppressors. It took a bit more than a century for a more genuine call for independence from the Ottomans to resound across Arabia and the Fertile Crescent. It also took less than 4 years for it to be dashed by the colonial scheming of France and Britain, which divided the liberated Ottoman Arab provinces between them in 1918 into arbitrarily constructed colonial territories after they had colonized Egypt, North Africa, and the Gulf Coast. There are, in fact, horrendous stories about how the borders of countries like Iraq and Jordan were drawn on a napkin in a cocktail party in some high commissioner's mansion. Both of them are ascribed to the intrepid Gertrude Bell, who was an Islamic art historian. With independence in the middle of the 20th century, these colonies morphed into weak nation states, about which the late Tahsin Bashir, one of Egypt's foremost diplomats, could exclaim with deadpan seriousness, Egypt, and this is a quotation, Egypt is the only nation state in the region. The others are tribes with flags. Lacking some of the crucial components of what constitutes nations, the new states overcompensated by an exaggerated reliance on the ideologies of identity. While all of them pursued a statist agenda bedecked with all the trapping of nationalism, most of them subscribed at the same time to the rhetoric of larger identity formations, initially Arabic, and more recently, increasingly Islamic. Modeled on the French and German precedents, and complete with its own historical and territorial claims in ideological and symbolic programs, Arab nationalism peaked in the 1950s and 1960s. It found its fulfillment in the grand dreams of Gamal Abdel Nasser, after whom I am named, of a united Arab Republic, which was succeeded by a series of hastily cooked unification attempts that disappeared shortly after they were announced, and that left us only with a plethora of modified flags that riffed on the themes of the eagle and the star, and on the colors black, white, red, and green, all alleged symbols of Arabism. That existential dyad stilted the growth of the Arabic countries in the Middle East, both as independent states and as members of supranational regional organizations that presumably reflected their common causes, such as the Arab League, the Islamic Congress Organization, and the GCC recently. The duality of identity is palpable at the level of politics in the incessant bickering between these countries over borders, resources, history, belonging, and larger identity formations. It is also discernible in all cultural expressions sponsored by the states or by the various cultural and religious communities within their borders, some of which may be pursuing different and conflicting agendas. But it is most visible in the most public of those cultural expressions, monumental architecture, and most particularly those monuments that embody identity either because of their function or their symbolism. This is the historical background necessary to understand the role religious architecture plays in the Arab Middle East today, where pseudo-secular nationalism has been almost totally supplanted by the rising discourse on religion as identity marker. This religious discourse, however, is not totally new. It has existed all along, either in an underground form in some of the countries ruled by left-leaning military regimes, such as Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, or as a counter-ideology to Arabism in countries that used Islam as a framer of nationalism, such as Saudi Arabia and, to a lesser extent, the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia, in fact, based its whole national image on its Islamic identity and on its rulers' claim to the custody of the two holy Islamic shrines in Mecca and Medina. The country also sponsored and promoted a form of fundamentalist dogma, about which we heard earlier today, usually named Wahhabism, after a religious leader from Najd in Central Arabia, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who lived between 1703 and 1792, and who advocated a return to a purer and more conservative form of Islam. Saudi promotion of conservative religiosity, complete with a strict dogma, rigid dress code, and stripped-down religious architecture, is often accused of fomenting the emergence of fundamentalism in the region. But it is the catastrophic defeat of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the 1967 war with Israel, and the victory of the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979 that formed the two poles of the politicization of Islam as a response to the failures of the nation states to face up to foreign interference, economic corruption, and moral decadence. This badly understood and still evolving fundamentalist movement seeks a return to more authentic political and social foundations to govern the Islamic nation. Yet, despite of all its relentless and violent attacks on what it sees as the depravity of all Western cultural imports, the movement, as Mohammed al-Assad noticed, shows surprisingly little interest in the conceptual or aesthetic contours of architecture, including religious architecture. This said, 120,000 mosques were built in Egypt in the last 10 years. So building mosques and thinking about mosques are not the same. In fact, Islamic religious architecture has been essentially the domain of the ruler's patronage ever since a split between the ruling class and the ulama, or the religious scholars, developed in the early medieval period. As a result, the ulama, by and large, retreated from the political sphere, but maintained the religious, intellectual, and legal authority in the society, always under the watchful eye of and the financial control of the rulers, who also fancied themselves as defenders of the religion and upholders of its tenets. As part of that role, sultans and princes commissioned and sponsored the most celebrated medieval religious monuments, including almost all Friday mosques. They may have seen their patronage as acts of personal piety, but they definitely had urban visions and harbored political agendas as well. Patronizing religious monuments, which usually functioned as urban foci around which settlements grew, allowed them to fulfill their duties as rulers and to commemorate their names in the process. Things began to slowly change when the notion of the modern state, with its new institutions and governing mechanisms, appeared under Muhammad Ali Pasha, the semi-independent Pasha of Egypt between 1805 and 1848. His patronage of mosques, though still personal, autocratic, and rather arbitrary, shows signs of awareness of the role religious architecture can play in shaping the image of the new state, which he was cunningly building against all odds to be both modern and inscribed within the tradition of Islamic empires. In 1821, Muhammad Ali Pasha approached Pascal Xavier Coste, a French architect who lived and worked in Egypt, to design two dynastic mosques in his two capital cities, Cairo and Alexandria. After spending 2 years studying and illustrating the mosques of Cairo, Coste presented two designs that are in fact pioneering examples of consciously designed Arab architecture with their emphasis on Mamluk elements such as ribbed or carved domes with high profiles that rest on triangular corners, tri-lobed arched portals, and hypostyle plans. Though never built, these two projects anticipated and probably influenced a whole string of religious and public structures constructed in the second half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century in a neo-Mamluk style that was historicizing in its inspirations and nationalistic in its aspirations. But the mosque Muhammad Ali ultimately built at the Citadel of Cairo has a distinct Ottoman, pure central domed plan and two slender and high pencil minarets, a far cry from Coste's design. It, however, does not follow the example of contemporary Ottoman mosques erected in Istanbul in heavy Baroque or Rococo styles. Its plan and general structure most closely resemble the much earlier mosque of Sultan Ahmed, known as the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, and built between 1609 and 1617. This archaic Ottomanism must have been intentional, especially if we take into consideration the psychological makeup of Muhammad Ali and the political conditions of the period during which his mosque was designed and constructed, which is 1830 to 1848. Muhammad Ali, an exceedingly crafty Ottoman officer who managed to wrest the rule of Egypt from all of his opponents, he basically killed them, was pursuing a program of intense economic, social, and military restructuring that was aimed primarily at modernizing Egypt after Western models and creating a power base for his plans of territorial expansion. In 1830, he launched an all-out attack against his master, the Sultan, in Istanbul, and for 8 years, he defiantly reigned over an empire that extended into the Ottoman heartland of Anatolia. He seems not to have totally relinquished his dreams of rising to the pinnacle of the empire until 1841, when his army was driven out of Syria by a combined European Ottoman assault. His mosque was constructed during that period of struggle for control in the Ottoman Empire, and the Pasha probably intended it to articulate these aspirations. The reference to the glorious Ottoman past and the independence from the decadent Ottoman present are equally well expressed in the mosque's classical style, monumentality, and commanding location inside the Citadel of Cairo, which had been the seat of government in the country for at least 7 centuries. This may have been Muhammad Ali's idea of visually asserting his aims to take the place of the Ottoman Sultan and to revitalize the empire from his power base in Cairo. Such triumphalism was not to be expressed in a mosque in the Middle East until Saddam Hussein launched an international competition for a state mosque in Baghdad in the spring of 1982. The idea of a state mosque was not new. Various newly minted Islamic nations, such as Pakistan, Kuwait, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Sultanate of Brunei, had already erected splendid state mosques in their capitals before the Iraqi competition, as signs of their national character, which in all cases rested on a pronounced Islamic identity. The novelty in Baghdad was that, unlike its predecessors, Iraq was both an already established independent state and was ruled by a resolutely secular republican regime. For those of you who read Arabic, I want you to notice that Michel Afla is Islamized in this poster by adding the name Ahmad to him. That did not include Islam in its national rhetoric when the competition was announced. External circumstances, especially the ferocious war with Iran started the same year, may have heightened the importance of the project, which was initially proposed as part of the preparations for the Conference of Non-Aligned Nations planned for 1982 in Baghdad, but it never took place. But it was probably the aggrandizing impulse of Saddam Hussein, who was at that time busy concentrating all power in his own hands, that gave the project its monumentalizing urgency. The project went nowhere for a variety of reasons, and we are left with 6 designs by 6 shortlisted architects, of whom 3, and we've already seen some, Rasim Badran, Robert Venturi, and Ricardo Bofill, were at one time or another rumored to be close to receiving the final commission. All 3 designs emphasize grandeur, axiality, formal balance, repetition, and symmetry. All also, in a predictable postmodern spirit, rely heavily on reinterpreting historical elements from Iraqi and Islamic past. But it is the language of the brief and not the designs that best articulates the contradictions inherent in having a religious building as representative of a modern nation state. The brief, prepared by a committee that was headed by the well-known Iraqi architect Rifat Shadurji, asserts that the mosque is to become, quote, the highest expression in creative and physical terms of the religious, state, and national beliefs and aspirations of the people of Iraq and their leadership. No clearer statement can be found of the heavy burden laid on architecture to represent at the same time religion and a nation, especially one that was professing pseudo-secularism while succumbing to a severe cult of personality. The duality of identity, national and ecumenical, already imposed on modern religious architecture and contradictory in and by itself, is here further complicated by a third claimant, a personified state, forcibly reduced to a pervasive leader who at the same time embodies and dictates the beliefs and aspirations of the nation. Saddam Hussein may have been an extreme case of such a leader, but to its misfortune, the modern Middle East has more than its fair share of only slightly milder versions of totalitarian rulers, many of whom built major mosques that carry either their names or the names of members of their families. Unsurprisingly, the most revealing example of a state equals person mosque was commissioned by an absolute king, the mosque of Hassan II in Casablanca, Morocco. Built between 1986 and 1993 for an exorbitant cost, some say 700 million euros, that all Moroccans had to shoulder through a mandatory mosque tax that was imposed for 3 years on all Moroccans. This gigantic monument by the sea is the epitome of the overlap between nation and religion in the reconception of contemporary Arab states, magnified by the king's claim to symbolically embody them both. Coming on the heels of a slew of religious buildings constructed all over Morocco during the long reign of Hassan II between 1961 and 1999, the mosque surpasses them all in its carefully chosen and symbolically loaded location, unprecedented size, and superlative decoration. All three aspects had to do with the expressed desire of the conservative king to project religious and monarchic authority, actually seen as interrelated, continuity with the past, and strategic relevance in the present day as Africa's gate to Europe. All, however, ultimately revolved around the person of the king as the representative of the nation and the guardian of its religiosity through his dynasty's claim of prophetic lineage. The mosque's site is the first significant component of its multi-layered narrative. Half built on stilts in the Atlantic Ocean, in a spot that forms the western end of the Islamic world and the closest point to Europe, the mosque is said to represent a message about the presence of Islam at a stone's throw from Europe's southern shores. The enormous minaret, modeled after historic Moroccan examples and planted on the short axis of the rectangular mosque, reinforces this message by its sheer size and its modern-day pyrotechnics, with a laser beam projecting from its top in the direction of Mecca and visible from 20 miles away. But floating the mosque on water has a more Islamically resonant connotation that is said to have been expressed by Hassan II himself, using the analogy of the Quranic creation verse. The verse is Hud number 7, and he it is who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and his throne was over the water. The monarch is reported to have declared, quote, "I want to build this mosque on the water because God's throne is on the water. Therefore, the faithful who go there to pray, to praise the Creator on firm soil, can contemplate God's sky and ocean." End of quote. A very ambitious and enigmatic proclamation that could not have come but from a person who takes the hermeneutical authority bestowed on him by his prophetic lineage very seriously. The scale and richness of the architecture and decoration of the mosque are based on the idea promulgated by the king himself that the architectural language of the past is the only legitimate one for building in Morocco. The French architect, Michel Pinceau, was thus limited in his design to explorations of monumentality and opulence rather than devising a new vocabulary to fit the time and occasion. The insistence of Hassan II on the exclusive use of Moroccan traditional elements and ornamental patterns and material in his eponymous mosque was, however, an established practice. The king was known for his encouragement of the revival and maintenance of traditional building and decorative crafts. His various monumental projects provided both employment for thousands of craftsmen and models for other powerful Moroccans to follow in their own buildings. But the reverence he showed to tradition may have had a political dimension as well. The distant past, where both the glorious traditional buildings of Morocco and the long-lasting dynasty of the king, the Alawid, find their roots, carries notions of legitimacy and permanence, both powerful political tools for an absolute sovereign. Both are also predicated on an assumption of imperviousness to change, which is, as we all know, problematic both as a political and architectural principle. The Mosque of Hassan II seems to have had a domino effect in the Arab world in the last decade. Many states, republican and monarchical alike, followed suit and built or commissioned new, gigantic, and ultra-opulent mosques named either for the state or for its ruler. Unlike the Mosque of Hassan II, though, the patrons of these mosques did not insist on purity of style or historical authenticity, possibly because their countries do not have a recognizable separate stylistic heritage. They chose instead buildings with multiple references to Islamic historical styles, although they showed a marked preference for the Mamluk and Ottoman imperial ones. Thus, we have a new major mosque in Muscat in Oman, named after Sultan Qaboos, and built between 1993 and 2001 by Karelian Alawi LLC, a local Omani construction company, in a modernized and stripped down Mamluk vocabulary with a mixture of Andalusian and Mamluk patterns to decorate the domed interior. In Abu Dhabi, as we had seen, the funerary mosque of Sheikh Zayed, built between 1995 and 2007 by a succession of architects that began with the little-known Syrian Yusuf Abdelki, is essentially a more opulent rendition of late imperial Mughal mosques, if this were at all possible, complete with the world's most expansive use of pietra dura, made famous by the dazzling surfaces of the Taj Mahal, which covers most of the mosque's floors and walls. In downtown Beirut, the Muhammad Al-Amin Mosque, built between 2002 and 2007 and funded by the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, became known as the Hariri Mosque when Hariri was buried next to it after his assassination in 2005. The mosque recalls both the Muhammad Ali Mosque in Cairo and its model, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque in Istanbul, in an unmistakable reference to great Islamic Sunni rulers and better Islamic imperial times in a city in which the Sunni Muslims are losing their traditional dominance to both Christians and Shiite Muslims. Finally, the government of Algeria recently unveiled the design of the new Grand Mosque of Algiers, designed by the German firm KSP Jürgen Engel. Monumental in a classical sense, the mosque is a thoroughly modern structure, even though it could not drop the requirements for a central dome, a square minaret, and arches as recognizable markers of Maghrebi Islamic architecture. It did, however, highlight the geometric and structural qualities of these elements instead of focusing on their ornamental ones. But if the Arabic governments that still teeter between religion and pseudo-secularism are sponsoring monumental mosques as markers of their religiously sustained authority or as appeasement for the growing popular piety, what are the regimes that brandish Islam as identity doing? Here we have two cases, one Sunni, i.e. Saudi Arabia, and one Shi'i, i.e. Iran, in addition to the new liberated Iraq, whose government is fast turning into an unabashedly Shiite theocracy. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran are busily engaged in sponsoring mosques abroad. Saudi Arabia has been at it for years and has built or co-sponsored the building of hundreds, if not thousands, of mosques all over the world. Iran, having only recently reclaimed the mantle of Shiite leadership, is more selective. Its building program mostly targets areas of heavy Shiite concentration in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, and focuses on reviving worship in neglected Shiite shrines in the same countries. And here you have two examples from Syria. At home, the Saudi government takes pride in its custody of the two major shrines in Mecca and Medina, which have been undergoing continuous expansions since the 1950s to accommodate the rapidly mounting numbers of pilgrims. The expansions of the two haram have obliterated the last vestiges of their long architectural history, except for the most sacred ones. And many critics have pointed out the selective policy of demolition pursued by the Saudi authorities. Recently, the market-driven construction boom that has invaded the cities of the Gulf has reached Mecca, where real estate values around the haram have soared to astronomical levels. This trend is most shockingly represented by the new gigantic and luxurious residential and hotel buildings designed around the Kaaba by some of the most famous architects practicing today, Norman Foster and Zaha Hadid. In addition to the already almost completed series of towers called Abraj al-Bayt and designed by the large Arabic firm Dar al-Handasa that look like a huge Big Ben surrounded by smaller towers that dwarf the Haram. The Islamic Republic of Iran, though professing a more austere approach, has shown itself to be prone to similar acts of aggrandizement when it comes to religious architecture. Preferring more open designs for its religious structures, which are typically called musallas instead of mosques, in reference to the tradition of holding open-air prayers during holidays, the Iranian government has sponsored vast new musallas in major cities in the country. The gargantuan Imam Khomeini Musalla in Tehran, begun more than 10 years ago and still incomplete, is designed by the Iranian architect Parviz Muayyad Ahd. When completed, it will boast the largest prayer surface and the tallest minarets in the world. Its scheme, however, owes much to those of medieval Iranian 4E1 mosques, with a direct reference to the Taqi Kisra, the huge palatial Iwan built in the 5th century CE and still standing in the ruins of Ctesiphon, the old Sasanian capital south of Baghdad in Iraq. The Musalla of Isfahan, on the other hand, also incomplete, is a thoroughly high-tech structure. Surrounded by 4 towers that look more like telecommunications towers than minarets, and covered by a series of huge pre-stressed and ribbed concrete geodesic domes, the Musalla was chosen as one of the best structural projects in the world in an international symposium held in Rio de Janeiro in 1999. Though different in design, the two musallas well illustrate that using the religious structure as national monuments in the contemporary Middle East crosses all boundaries between Arabs and Persians and between Sunnis and Shias. In the meantime, what is happening to the expressions of religiosity in the architecture of the Christians in the Middle East? The answer is roughly the reverse of how Islamic religious architecture has evolved. To illustrate the point, I will use a string of churches built in Cairo over the last century. Church building obviously prospered under European colonial rule, for the colons favored their coreligionists and sometimes even financed their buildings. Moreover, Arab Christians, by virtue of their exposure to Western norms and ways of life through missionary schools and organizations, developed tastes for things European. This appeared in their churches as well, such as the expiatory church built by the famous Slovenian architect Antonio Lasiak in 1910-1911 for the Egyptian Prime Minister Boutros Ghali Pasha on the precinct of the historic St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Cathedral. Lasiak, who practiced in Egypt for almost half a century, uses here an austere and classicized Romanesque language that bears little resemblance to traditional Coptic architecture. Half a century later, when the church decided to build a new cathedral in the same precinct, the style and the architect it chose were Coptic Egyptian. This was 1968, and the secular Arab nationalism of Abdel Nasser was still dominant. Church authorities, headed by Archbishop Kyrillos VI, or Cyril VI, who was archbishop between 1959 and 1971, took part in this exuberance and even benefited from the willingness of the leadership to see itself as equally munificent to all national religious sects. In a story never told before, Archbishop Kyrillos approached Abdel Nasser to ask for the state financial help in completing the building of the new cathedral, which faced a deficit of 2 million Egyptian pounds. In 1968, this would be equivalent to about $100 million today. Abdel Nasser, complaining of the scarcity of funds, asked the Archbishop where he sees the funding coming from. The Archbishop replied, the Waqf money. That is, the money of the religious endowment that is controlled by the state and that comes from Islamic sources, but is supposed to be distributed on religious structures. Abdel Nasser laughed and begged the archbishop not to put him in trouble with the Muslim ulama, who will loudly oppose such a move, but promised nonetheless to provide the funds. And he did, by taking the money from the revenues of the Suez Canal. Such exchange between the president and the archbishop is impossible to imagine today. Copts in general are on the defense in present-day Egypt. In fact, one of the most recent Christian religious structures built in Cairo through remissions from expatriate Copts perfectly illustrates this defensive mood. The church of Sam'an al-Kharraz is literally carved in the mountain, along with two smaller churches, St. Mark's and St. Bola's, and the huge amphitheater. The story of Sam'an al-Kharraz, revived and amplified by the Coptic Church in recent years, poignantly emphasizes that feeling of defensiveness and alarm among the Copts of Egypt. Al-Kharraz was a simple shoemaker who rescued the Coptic community from the wrath of the Caliph, most probably the Fatimid al-Hakim, around the year 1000, by rising to the challenge presented by the Fatimid ulama that a Christian faithful, according to Christian scripture, should be able to move the mountain. And Sam'an did. His story is represented many times on the side of the mountain today, whence his church stands, and many parables attributed to various contemporary church leaders and pertaining to today political relationships are inscribed nearby, in another direct reference to how the Copts feel. True that not all Christian communities in the Middle East are under threat, but the trend is very real and alarming. Architecture here plays the role of symbolic illustrator, but the solution should come from elsewhere. Where does this road lead? Architecturally, there is little hope for new innovative designs for mosques, given the reigning traditionalism in taste as well as in politics in the Arab Middle East today. With the mosques that Muhammad showed us, I'll add only a handful of experimental mosque designs that have appeared recently. An elegant and sinuous envelope that rises in a pointed spire to form a minaret for a mosque designed by Zaha Hadid in Kuwait, and a tilted abstraction of the domed cube with a separate minaret designed by the Iranian architect Fariborz Hatam for Dubai, which he hopes will reward him, Dubai that is, with a real client. He designed it without a client, with its entrepreneurial spirit and aggressive economic laissez-faire. Both mosques, however, are still unbuilt, and there is no guarantee in the current atmosphere of restraint after the financial crisis of 2008 that they will ever be built. However, the real challenge in the current wave of mosque building is rather ideological. How to separate the political from the religious and recognize their mutual autonomy. A.W.N. Pugin thought that a return to church buildings in neo-Gothic style will restore to the industrial society of 19th century England some of its Christian kindness and humanism. President George W. Bush wanted to encourage faith-based charities to shoulder some of the social responsibilities of the state. Both are examples of the pitfalls of allowing the political and the religious to intermingle and overlap after humanity discovered that they should be separate. Both will be the poorer as a result. State mosques, by the very nature of their contradictory composite name, are another example of such a civic impoverishment. Thank you. Do I take questions? You decide on the time.
Thank you, Professor Ravat, for a wonderful talk and a marvelous keynote to this symposium. And he is more than happy to take some questions before we repair to the Gallery, are there some questions? Great talk. That's not a question.
There's one there. There's one coming.
Yes, sir.
Think,
Lyle.
What is the role of the foreign? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize.
Yeah,
that-
I heard it.
Well, we'll come back to you. I'll make sure that we're coming back to you. Yeah.
What is the role of the foreign architect in this story at the moment? So the Western architect who is brought in specifically for the project.
I would say closer to the role of a scalper.
Excalibur.
I mean, there's really no role. I have been personally involved in consulting a couple of Western firms on religious architectural design in the Arab world, and their ignorance is staggering. And their willingness to use cut and paste and pastiche images is just astounding. So the role really has been minimal, if at all. Yeah.
I
please.
have the microphone back. Thank you for your talk. Since I'm a Spaniard and I've been to Alhambra several
Can you speak
times.
up, please?
Yes. And I appreciate the architecture of Alhambra. And I wanted to ask whether you could maybe talk a bit about craft and how the traditions of building have been implemented or they have disappeared, because from the pictures we've seen of these mosques, it appears as if new modes of construction have been, like, there's an industry that has replaced the craft, maybe, if you could talk about it.
Well, that's a very difficult question for me to answer. I am no romantic. I'm actually an extremely materialist historian, and I know that the process of development of new professional approach to building usually result in the eradication of a lot of the building crafts. So we have, in few conservative examples, and I showed you the example of the King Hassan II in Morocco, a state that is willing and desirous to preserve the crafts. So it actually creates opportunities for that. Another state that is totally secular, as a matter of fact, the only secular state in the Middle East today, in the real sense of the word, which is my country of origin, Syria, is doing the exact same thing. It's actually encouraging crafts. The president building palaces and whatever it is that he's building around the country is constantly hiring craftsmen to decorate, but the architects are almost always foreign and well-known architects. So there is an attempt to basically keep the crafts alive, but I would say this is mostly artificial. The survival of the crafts will have to come from the crafts themselves. That is, they will have to rise to the challenge of new building methods, new building material, the cost effect of actually the craft itself. I mean, Damascus, for example, is very famous for few wood crafts. They have almost quadrupled in price recently, which put them totally out of market. So craftsmen may produce them, but it's only the president that could buy them.
Other questions?
Why do I have that look on your face as you're raising your finger?
I loved your talk, but partly because I subscribe to the same ideology that you subscribe to. Why
We were
Why
born
is it-
around the same time.
yeah. Why is it that people like you and I, who actually come from the Middle East, who are very familiar with what is going on over there right now, why is it that we cannot just simply be dismissed as hardcore secularists who insist on the separation of church and state? Your statement at the end of the day, at the end of your lecture, humanity has discovered the importance of the separation of religion and government, is not necessarily one that most people in our part of the world would actually subscribe to. So in a sense, we are a dying breed of secularists who are still holding to an idea whose time is gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the fact that you and I are in the United States of America is a very perfect indication. We are actually passé. We are totally démodé. I mean, I just came back from Damascus and Cairo, where I gave lectures in both cities, And I'm very much used now to being called names after my lectures. So this time, thankfully, actually, because my attack on Western policy was heavier than my attack on Islamic fundamentalism, I was actually considered okay. But normally, I'm really called names, and I do understand it. As a matter of fact, actually, I have absolutely no illusion about the total irrelevance of what I said today.
As people who know me, I have a great respect for the crafts, and I think you are a master craftsman in your lecturing.
Thank you.
Learned a lot and very well presented. But I wanted to mention on the question of why you have all those foreign architects doing the mosques, like Pinot in France and Robert Venturi in Iraq, and many of the foreign architects. And a lot of people complain about this, but those who complain, I think, are not justified to do this, because we have allowed in our schools of architecture for us to have a total memory loss of the history, the tradition, the architecture of the past. I had a student from, an architect from Syria, and he said, I want to learn Islamic architecture. He came to work with me. He couldn't draw a pointed arch. I said, what did you learn in your university in Syria? You can't draw a pointed arch? I told him, you realize that the pointed arch was introduced into Europe and made a revolution with the Gothic architecture? And you can't draw a pointed arch, do you draw round arches? It took me 15 years. When I was in Egypt at the time of Nasser, we had no books. We had no foreign currency. We had nothing. So at the time, again, the arrogance of young age came out first of the university, and I was appointed as a member of the staff, and Hassan Fathi saw a bit of my arrogance, and he passed by the Sultan Hassan Mosque and he said, you see that? And he showed me the stalactite of the Sultan Hassan Mosque. He said, when you can do that, call yourself an architect. And I went every day to work at this, but I look at it and I say, how did they work it out? There was no information. And then there was a German lady, fantastic lady.
Christel Kessler.
Christel Kessler. She told me a koshar did the ban of the hammamat of Damascus. Where is the book? I never saw that book. She said, here's the address of a koshar in France, write to him. And anyhow, it was going and coming until I got the commission of the King Saud Mosque. And it was a Mamluk mosque that was done 30 years ago, and the concrete was mixed with seawater, and it was already collapsing after 30 years, and it was closed. So the mayor of Jeddah said, I want you to restore it. We got the Bin Laden construction group and everything, and engineers, and they said, no, we have to condemn the building. So he said, okay, the man who did it in a Mamluk style, so you do it in a Mamluk style. But the Mamluk was a hodgepodge, you know, sort of mixture of not somebody not knowing the vocabulary. So the first thing I did was, I said, I'll do the Sultan Hassan entrance porch with the minaret, which is one of the most beautiful. And I said it will be good to have it there because you never know the restoration in Egypt. They might demolish even the mosque. And I know that in Egypt there is the underwater is demolishing all the mosques now. The water is rising. I thought they were cleaning the mosque, but it was the sewage going up in the old mosques. So we built it, and then there was I don't know if you know him, Abdelbaq Ibrahim.
Allah yarhamu.
Yeah, and he was my teacher at one time, and then we were teaching together at the university. And he went to Hassan Fathi and told him, what is Islamic architecture if Abdul Wahid al-Wakil has copied the Sultan Hassan portal and minaret? And Hassan Fathi looked at him like this and told him, Abdul Ba'i, you go and do it, it will take you 100 years. What do you mean he copied? He got a mold and put it in and then poured it there. And there was Dr. Saleh Lameh, who was a restorer, and he told him, you think it's easy? We have problems restoring one balcony of the minarets, you know, and he worked it all. So I had to do it myself because the only people who could do the stalactites are in Turkey today. And this is the biggest problem that people are not aware who teach at university and so on. They are not aware of the importance of the crafts. The crafts has been destroyed. The only remaining crafts are maybe in Syria and in Turkey.
In Morocco.
And Morocco. I worked with the Moroccan groups also. And I got them to do the Qiblatain Mosque. And then I gave them each a part and I said, show me what you can do from your stalactites muqarnas. And then they did examples like this, different I got the best, you know, from Morocco. I had my friend, the Ministry of Culture, and he told me, please give them work because they are dying. So I got them there. And I took them and I said, this is a nightclub. This is an hotel. The tourism industry spoiled them. And then I started working with them properly. And then they said, excuse me, you allow us not to call you architect. I said, why? Because they stopped calling me architect. They said, because architect for us is an insult. We'll call you muallim, master, craftsman. And this is to show you how the craftsmen have no respect for the architect.
Mm-hmm.
Because the architect is not aware of their craftsmanship.
Sure, sure.
But
Your question actually opens, the gentleman that asked me about the foreign architects, can you just show me your hand? I actually need to somehow nuance my answer. The architects that are building mosques on commissions today are not adding anything to the thinking about designing architects. That said, I'm not actually saying that foreign whatever, you fill the blank, and they are actually not aware or not contributing. Scholars who are studying mosques in the West are actually doing most of the job of understanding and perhaps, as a matter of fact, extracting from the understanding some sort of principles. So I didn't want to come down very hard, or I didn't want to be misunderstood as saying that foreigners cannot. Actually, they can. All I'm saying that at this point in time, in the current economic atmosphere, most architects that are vying for commissions in the Middle East, especially for commissions of symbolic buildings, they're coming to them with absolutely no understanding and no familiarity. And they want to do it very fast. So in a sense, that's the criticism for these specific architects.
yes, but also, talking of foreign...
I need to get some more questions.
You'll get your panel tomorrow.
Yeah. Let me just get some more questions.
Very quickly, I just want to ask Nasser if you're aware of the 6 foreign entries to the Mecca reconstruction project.
No, but I would love to know more about
and
them.
it's fabulous work. I think you should look at it. Thanks.
We have time for one or more questions.
There's a hand over there.
Where? I don't see the hand.
There on the left.
Okay, just give us a second. Why do the people with questions always stand in the back?
So we don't get caught. Actually, Nasser, my question...
I need to see your face.
Oh, there. Now I'm caught. I think my question was had to do with, so you mentioned sort of this binary between secularity and religious architecture and politics versus religion. And I think that my question would be, But then how does Islamic motif or Coptic motif enter into secular or civil buildings? And has there not been a strong history of that, aside from just the mosques and the churches
Of course.
and the like?
Of
And
course.
I guess why didn't you mention,
Because
or is that not happening today?
Because that's not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is the discrepancy between a state that claims to be based on modern notion of what a nation state is, and a state that at the same time is cloaking itself in the cloak of Islam, whatever that is, and using the state mosques projects as a projection of that image. I'm saying that there is a contradiction between these two. That is, I mean, ultimately, the rational end of my argument, either have an Islamic state or have a secular state. What we have now is in between. Of course, I do not agree with an Islamic state, but at least it will be rational. It will be actually in harmony with itself.
But I guess what I'm trying to hint at is, do you not think that then maybe if the motifs entered into civic buildings, that it would not be... They have. And actually some of the most beautiful periods of these are the periods that we usually call, again, after European models, La Belle Époque. You have a lot of motifs that have been totally stripped from whatever possible meaning they might have. And I'm not so sure they had meanings to start with. You know, I mean, you call them Islamic motifs, but other than the fact that they were produced in Islamic times, we have no indications, historically speaking, that they had meanings, that they had meanings that relate to Islam. Many people would disagree with this statement. But they have been appropriated and reused. I mean, Pascal Coste was one of the earliest examples, and I showed his, as a matter of fact, was the earliest example, and I showed his example. But if you look through about 1890 all the way down to about 1940, you would realize that Islamic motifs have been used as motifs with absolutely no ascription to Islam or Islamic. And they have been extracted from whatever source they were coming from and reused in very beautiful new combinations. I mean, I can show you on my computer, which I have here, hundreds of images of buildings that are train stations, banks, nightclubs, yeah, the Coptic Museum, I mean, that have used these in compositionally beautiful arrangements. So, no, I mean, once you move in that direction, meaningfulness becomes meaningless in my argument.